On my research, we're mainly looking at trying to maintain a low stomach pH in that nursery pig for the first 2 or 3 weeks post-weaning until really that gastrointestinal tract fully develops. So when the pig is on the sow, it's consuming milk from the sow's milk, so that bacterial fermentation is happening. So that's where the main source of stomach acidity is coming from. But ultimately, once that pig's weaned and they have a low feed intake, and even though there may be lactose present in the diet, ultimately its feed intake is not high enough to maintain a low stomach pH, and hydrochloric acid production is limited. So really, my research has been focused on trying to incorporate low acid binding ingredients that help to maintain that low stomach pH in that young pig to help with health status of the gastrointestinal tract, as well as utilizing nutrients to the best of their ability.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of the Swine Canada podcast show. I am Dan Columbus, and I'll be your host for today's episode. And with me today, I have Ethan Stas, who is a Ph.D. student at Kansas State University. So welcome, Ethan, to the show.
Yep. Thanks for having me. Glad to be on the show, and it's good to see you.
Yeah, it'd be an interesting topic to talk about today and what you're doing for your PhD research. But before we get into that, because people might not know, especially that you're in K-State and this is the Canadian show, that they might not know who you are. So just ask you to kind of introduce yourself and let us know about your journey so far.
Yep. So just some background on myself. So I'm originally from Pennsylvania. I did my undergraduate degree at Pennsylvania State University, and then moved into a master's program with the Swine nutrition group here at Kansas State, and then finished that up roughly a year and a half ago, and have been working on my PhD ever since.
Working with nature and not against it, piglets fed AX3 see significant and improved feed efficiency. Producers know the reality of needing to reduce antibiotic and zinc use. AX3 Digest is a highly digestible novel protein that promotes improved in-barn performance, piglet health, and minimizes the need for zinc in the diet. For more information, visit www.protecta.com. That's www.protecta.com.
I think everybody will be very familiar with the Swine group down there. I think they've made a big name for themselves. But today we're here to talk about your research. And so you've indicated that you are working on acid binding capacity, which I think a lot of people are probably aware of the importance of, or the benefits, say, of acidification of diets and water and stuff like that, and why we want acid. But this is kind of taking a different take on it. So we'll start with, what is acid binding capacity and why should we be looking at this?
Yeah, so I think, on my research, we're mainly looking at trying to maintain a low stomach pH in that nursery pig for the first 2 or 3 weeks post-weaning until really that gastrointestinal tract fully develops. So when the pig is on the sow, it's consuming milk from the sow's milk, so that bacterial fermentation is happening. So that's where the main source of stomach acidity is coming from. But ultimately, once that pig's weaned and they have a low feed intake, and even though there may be lactose present in the diet, ultimately its feed intake is not high enough to maintain a low stomach pH, and hydrochloric acid production is limited. So really, my research has been focused on trying to incorporate low acid binding ingredients that help to maintain that low stomach pH in that young pig to help with health status of the gastrointestinal tract, as well as utilizing nutrients to the best of their ability.
Yeah, so you mentioned, low acid binding ingredients. So what characteristic are you looking for then, or how do you test that or characterize them in that way?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to probably describe that would be discussing how we really measure it in the lab. So first, before we applied it on the actual pig side in the diets, we analyze various ingredients. And what we do is we take half a gram sample, we suspend that in distilled deionized water, and then we titrate that with hydrochloric acid until we reach a stable pH of 4. And then from there, we can calculate the ABC4 value of that ingredient. And then ultimately, the ingredients that make up the diet, we can calculate the value of the complete diet being fed to the pig as well. But there's various ingredients that can affect the ABC4 value of the diet. First off, being cereal grains. So cereal grains, although they may have a lower value compared to most other ingredients, because they make up such a large portion of the diet, they can influence it quite a bit. So, for example, wheat-based diets are going to have much lower acid binding capacity values than that of a corn-based diet. With protein sources we found can vary greatly. So really the protein source and how that compares to conventional soybean meal or whatever the main protein source may be plays a big factor as well. And then also obviously things like minerals such limestone can raise the ABC4 value quite a bit. And then also obviously acidifier inclusion will help to lower the acid binding value of the diet as well.
Right. So you've been measuring the ABC4 value and the different ingredients. Is there a way, based on what's in that ingredient, to predict what its binding capacity is going to be, or do you have to do the lab test in order to determine that?
Yep. So that's a good question. There's definitely one thing that can influence the value, and you kind of get an idea of what the value may be is the level of calcium that's present in that sample. For example, we know that limestone's oftentimes added into soybean meal to help with flowability. So the level of limestone that gets added into soybean meal is going to further raise the ABC4 value of the diet. So really, when we think of those minerals, specifically calcium and maybe some others such as magnesium, the more level of those minerals in certain ingredients, the higher the ABC4 value is going to be.
Once you have the values, how do you incorporate that into the feed formulation? Are they additive, or is there a different way that you can incorporate them?
Yep. So right now we treat them as if they were additive in the diet. So all of our ingredients that are being included in the diet have basically loading values, just like we would with nutrients. They have values for their acid binding capacity. So we utilized in the complete diet to ultimately come up with the overall diet value. So that's what we do from an ingredient side. Now, we don't necessarily know if it's completely additive. One thing that we've found is that when we actually analyze the complete diet, their acid binding values are usually lower than what we formulate them to. We don't specifically know exactly why this may be, but it may be partially due to certain ingredients that may have very high values, but are included at low percentages, such as the premixes or limestone or zinc oxide or something along those lines. But yeah.
Right. So I assume you've done some studies in this area to kind of look at that. So maybe we'll just get into what specific studies you've done and what you found.
Yep. So we've done a couple studies now. The first study we did was really evaluating the concept of low acid binding formulation and high acid binding formulation. So really, we had two different ABC4 levels, and then those diets were either with or without zinc oxide. So it was really a 2x2 factorial study. And what we found in that study is that when zinc oxide was not present, pigs fed a low ABC4 diet had improved average daily gain, improved feed efficiency. They had a lower instance of removals and mortality. So that study really opened up the potential opportunities to low ABC4 diet formulation. From that, we conducted a few other studies really evaluating the ABC4 level of the diet and what may be optimal or even possible based on the ingredients that we can utilize. The first study was basically a titration evaluating the ABC4 level. And what we found based on ABC4 level is pretty much as we increase the ABC4 level of the diet, we saw a pretty linear response that as that acid binding capacity level increases, we not only see a reduction in growth performance, but also we see a lot more diarrhea prevalence and looser consistency of those feces. So that study really showed us that those low ABC4 diets can help us to improve nutrient utilization, also less occurrence of that post-weaning diarrhea that's often prevalent in young pigs.
Yeah, so I guess with that first study, so when you did your different levels of ABC4, is that confirmed in the diet with a test, or is that what you formulated?
Yep. So when we formulate to low ABC4 levels, the formulated values is what we went by. We did analyze those values just to confirm that what we formulated to was similar to what we had analyzed. And what we found was, like I said, the analyzed values were lower than the formulated values, but the trend was still the same, that the low ABC4 diets were much lower in their ABC4 value than the high ABC4 diets based on our formulation.
Right. Did you do anything in the pig itself, like confirm the acidity or pH in the stomach or digestibility or anything?
No. For that first study, we did not. The first one was a commercial study, so it was on a large operation, and it was really just testing the concept of it and seeing if, okay, do these low ABC formulation strategies, will they have a potential benefit in these pigs?
Right. So I guess then my last question with these ones then is, because you formulated these different diets, so I guess everybody's going to ask, what was the difference in the formulation?
Yep.
What ingredients did you put in your low versus your high, or how did you adjust that?
Yep. So really, like I said, I've mentioned a few ingredient strategies to be able to lower the ABC4 value of the diet. Really, for these studies, we utilized two strategies to get to low ABC4 values. The first being we utilized a specialty soy protein source that has a very low ABC4 value, specifically negative 13 milliequivalents per kilogram. And then we also utilized a combination of fumaric and formic acid to hit that low ABC4 target. And then to increase ABC4 value, ultimately, we either replaced that specialty soy protein source with another soy protein source that has a high acid binding capacity value, or we reduce the level of acidifiers.
Yeah. Okay. So you did mention too that this was observed without zinc in the diet. So
Yep.
I guess that, my thought is that, so with zinc, you didn't see this. Does it like totally eliminate any potential effects that you'd have?
Yeah. So that's some area research I think we need to revisit moving forward is, can we still get a benefit to low ABC4 diet formulation with zinc oxide in the diet as well? Because most of the studies we've done has been in diets without zinc oxide. Now we always have a positive control or a diet containing zinc oxide. And what we found is the low acid binding diet, even without zinc oxide, can perform to similar levels as our positive control. But I do think we need to reevaluate potential low ABC4 formulation in addition to zinc oxide in the diet. That gets a little tricky from a formulation standpoint, because zinc oxide also has a very high acid binding value. So being able to formulate to a low value with zinc oxide in the diet is a real challenge. But I do think it is an area of opportunity moving forward.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was thinking, right? Because these are both potential strategies,
Yep.
to improve the health of the animal and productivity of the animal. Zinc oxide very well shown that those high levels are beneficial. Um, but if they're not going to work together, then that complicates things, right?
Yep.
Um, and then, but also with your research, this is potentially one of those tools because, I think everybody knows that eventually we're going to be limited in zinc oxide
Yep.
use, right? Or zinc use. I should say zinc oxide, but yeah, so we need to look at the different ways of promoting this. So you did mention that your second study was looking at optimal levels. So did you find that there's an optimal level to reach, or maybe like at least you have to be below that?
Yeah. So based on European recommendations, we really formulated our first study to 150 milliequivalents per kilogram for the first 7 to 10 days after weaning, and then they recommend that we bump that up to around 200 milliequivalents per kilogram for the next 2 weeks, basically until that pig's about 3 to 4 weeks post weaning. So that's what we started off formulating was to those low levels of 150 and 200. And then, like I said, we titrated that up. One thing that we found is to get to that low level is pretty difficult. And what we found in our first study is actually the low ABC4 diet did have reduced feed intake and a little lower average daily gain. And we think that's just because of the level of acidifiers that we had to utilize. So actually what we found based on our studies was the optimal level was around 200 milliequivalents for the first 7 to 10 days, and then 250 there afterwards. So that's where we found the most benefit. And again, it may be more beneficial to go to lower levels, but in a corn-based diet and without getting too high on acidifier inclusion, those lower levels are pretty difficult to get to.
Yeah. So is that level, even the one that you kind of identified, is that possible to achieve without the acidifiers, or is that kind of like a critical component?
It's possible to achieve, but there's a number of different ingredient strategies to get to that low level. So in our formulation, we utilized acidifiers, as I mentioned, the low ABC4 protein source, but we also utilized crystalline lactose opposed to like whey permeate or whey powder because that's associated with a very low ABC4 value as well. So it was a combination of different things to get to that low ABC4 level. So it is difficult. It's possible to get to that lower level, but it requires a number of different ingredient strategies to get there.
Yeah. So I guess what are the next steps? Like, what are you guys thinking for what that's coming up in the future?
Yep. So I think there's a couple things we'll go down and continue to evaluate. One would be, like I mentioned, a potential combination of not only low ABC4 diets but also zinc oxide to see if we can maybe get an added benefit. We really want to go back and put it back into a commercial setting to see if we can get promising results with commercial pigs opposed to our university farms here, and specifically seeing if we can get not only a consistent response in growth performance, but also on the fecal consistency, as I mentioned as well. And I think we also need to continue to evaluate formulation strategies to maybe make it easier to get to those lower ABC4 levels. And maybe those very low levels are not necessarily most optimal, but is there a balance between performance and economic formulation to get to the optimal ABC4 value as well? Because most of the diets I've seen throughout the industry, the acid binding capacity is pretty high in those diets. So maybe at a lower level, not maybe as low as we have been going, but maybe even a slightly lower level that we are currently in the industry can provide a little bit of a benefit there as well.
Yeah, a lot of questions and factors that will come into play. I'll be interested to see your results. Early life is really, and nursery diets is really one of the areas that I'm most interested in. So I'll be watching for your papers when they come out. So I think it's probably going to be pretty obvious, but I ask everybody, if there's a take-home message that you want our listeners to get from today's episode, what would that be?
My take-home message would probably be that those pigs that we're weaning off of these sows, even though we may be pushing to greater weaning ages in the industry now, they still have a relatively immature gastrointestinal tract. So we should always be looking at ways that we can improve the health status and nutrient utilization of those young pigs to get them off to a better start and ultimately lead to more opportunities down the line as well.
Yeah, great message.
It's time for our famous 3.
So before I let you go, we ask all of our guests 3 questions. I don't know if you did this on your other episode, but I'll ask you again anyway. So the first one, and being a student, this one will be interesting, is what is your favorite swine resource? So your go-to every time you have a question.
My favorite swine resource would probably be the professors we have here at Kansas State. So I'm lucky that we have 5 professors here at Kansas State. So if I have a question, most likely one of them is going to have a pretty darn good answer. And they've had a lot of experiences in the industry. So they're probably definitely my biggest resource here.
They behind the camera making you say that?
Nope, they're upstairs right now. Yeah. So.
No, I'm just obviously the people, and we all know that the ones down there are doing great work and have a lot of information. So I think that's pretty obvious.
Yeah.
So our next one is, when you think outside the box, outside of agriculture and swine, a favorite book that you've read recently or would always recommend.
Probably my favorite book that I've read. So it's a book called Quiet. So I'm a pretty introverted type of person. So this book was really about how to optimize being an introvert in maybe an industry that values communication and a lot of interaction with people. So that was a book that I found was very helpful on letting me communicate with people and building relationships within the industry as well.
Well, I'm going to have to look that one up because, people are always surprised, but I'm not as extroverted as I seem. Yeah. So it's one of those things, and we always, we reward the people that are outspoken and are loud, for lack of a better word, and not so much the ones that are quiet. So yeah, definitely have to look that one up. And then, so our last one, and you just mentioned you have a number of them right there. So when you look at the leaders that you've had in your life or mentors, I don't know if you can bring in swine producers that you've worked with, right? Like what's a characteristic of those people that tend to be more successful or are better leaders than maybe those that aren't?
Yeah, I would say one characteristic that I've noticed across the industry on people that seem to be real successful and have led to promising things throughout the industry is really critical thinking and asking a lot of questions and really thinking through the process of our formulation strategies or our health status or marketing tools or whatever it may be in the swine industry. Those people that continue to critical think and ask questions on why we're doing something or what's the thought process behind some various strategy. So critical thinking's been one thing that I've noticed is been pretty prevalent across our industry, which I think is a good thing. So.
Yeah, no, definitely a good thing. Well, I will thank you once again for coming on the show, sharing some of the work that you've been doing, results, and Like I said, I think we'll all look forward to the future results that you find. So we'll make sure to bring you back on and let our audience know about your findings.
Perfect. Thank you.